What's up, YouTube? It's the Action Figure Grader coming back to you with a vintage Star Wars variant discussion. And one thing that I've been doing some research on, and I thought I'd share with you, is if you are looking to buy Lili Ledy Mexican-made vintage Star Wars figures, one thing to look out for is that, especially AFA-graded ones, figures graded by the Action Figure Authority. One thing to look out for is the Made in Mexico label versus Lili Ledy on the AFA grading sticker, and what the differences mean, and kind of the history behind that. And look, I know I'm a loser, all right? I'm very well aware of that. Probably no one who's going to watch this video actually cares at all about any of this stuff. But I'm doing it really because I love sharing this information, even if it's only with myself, all right? But the reason I wanted to talk about this is that, I kept trying to figure out, okay, what does Made in Mexico mean versus Lili Ledy? And this is a while ago, but I did some research on it, and I wanted to kind of share with you the results of that. I've kind of touched on it a little bit during my Reese Lili Ledy unboxing, but let's go into a little bit more detail because I've got some good hard action figures in front of you here that I think will help tell the story. So, all right, so Lili Ledy, as you guys know, if you're a collector, Lili Ledy was a manufacturer down in Mexico who made licensed Lucasfilms Star Wars figures. So these were not bootlegs. There's plenty of Mexican bootlegs out there. Some of them are in better quality than others, but these were actually licensed figures that Kenner worked with Lili Ledy, and they actually produced their own figures down there, their own manufacturing plants before going out of business eventually, I think in the late 1980s or early 1990s. So let's take a look at those. I've got several Lili Ledys. So this is my Darth Vader Lili Ledy. 1977 Lili Ledy Star Wars figure, loose action figure, Darth Vader, 85. Okay, so this is an actual Lili Ledy. And then I also have this one here. This one says, oh, my camera won't focus. There we go. 1977 Kenner Star Wars loose action figure, no COO. That's what those two dashes mean. Darth Vader, made in Mexico, U85, near mint. Well, what is the difference? What is the difference? I don't understand. Well, it's an important distinction because you'll see on eBay various figures listed as Lili Ledy, and then when you look at the pictures, the AFA sticker will say Made in Mexico. It won't say Lili Ledy. So you got to know what you're buying, and some sellers are a little bit less than honest about what you're buying, and they'll put Lili Ledy in the title for the figure, and then the AFA sticker will say Made in Mexico. So the Lili Ledy here on your left, what that means is that was a Lili Ledy figure has not only the figure being made by that factory, but all the accessories are Lili Ledy accessories, and the Made in Mexico, what that means is that it was also produced down there, but what happened was Kenner, they had a lot of overstock, figures they've already produced, or accessories they've already produced, or card backs they've already produced. Actually, not the card backs, but figures or accessories they've already produced, and they had a lot of overstock, so they sent it down to the Lili Ledy factory for their manufacturing, with the idea being that once those figures were carded, such as this Made in Mexico Darth Vader that you see here, they would then be shipped back to the U.S. for sale. So, I'm guessing that they probably, Kenner was trying to figure out a way to deal with the high demand for the figures. Their production was at, max capacity, so they enlisted the help of the Lili Ledy factory to produce figures for sale in the U.S. And so Lili Ledy had their own carded figures. They had their own card art, their own logo, Lili Ledy logo, but those are quite a bit different than just the Made in Mexico figures like this one. The Lili Ledy carded figures go for many thousands of dollars. They're very expensive. You don't see them very often for sale. And when they do sell, they go for a lot of money. But you do see quite a bit of these. And these are the Made in Mexico carded figures. There's only 13 figures that are made for that were made in Mexico with the U.S. kind of typical Kenner card back. And the vast majority of them were Return of the Jedi figures, like the Biker Scout, the Gamorrean Guard, Reese, all the Ewoks. The two notable exceptions are the Darth Vader, as you see here, and then Yoda. So both of those figures, I wouldn't really call those Return of the Jedi figures since they were released, Yoda was released on an Empire Strikes Back card, and then of course Darth Vader is one of the original 12. So those are really the only two exceptions. The other 11 or so were all Return of the Jedi figures, like Lando and Skiff Guard, things like that. 9 Nub. So if you see a figure that's made in Mexico, it has the AFA label, it's going to be one of those 13 figures, because those are the only 13 that they made. Now, the history behind that is that, a lot of collectors, the lore, quote unquote lore, is that that Kenner went to Lili Ledy and said, hey, you gotta produce these figures way better quality than you produced the Lili Ledy figures. And admittedly, some of the Lili Ledy figures do have poor paint applications. The figures are not quite as nice, some of them. But that is actually not true. I've done quite a bit of research on this, and the best resource for this is a website called Imperial Gunnery, and that website goes into a lot of detail, a lot of the history. It even goes into very specific close-ups of the individual figures. So I would highly recommend that. If I can refine that link, it's been a while since I've looked at it, but if I can find that link, I will put that in the description for this video, so you guys can check it out, because it's honestly, it's one of the best resources for Lili Ledy and for figuring out made in Mexico, things like that. But it goes into so much detail, and it's very great. It's just very comprehensive. So anyway, the rumor was anyway that these figures would have to be better quality than the standard Lili Ledy figures that were on the Lili Ledy card backs. But that is not in fact true. If you took a figure like this off of the card and compared it to, a good to better, or good to above average Lili Ledy figure, often the Ledy will be in as good a shape, or if not better. So that's kind of a random side note, but it's definitely not true that these figures had to have been produced to a higher standard of quality because Kenner demanded it. But you can see here in the AFA sticker, it's got the Return of the Jedi Back A Darth Vader made in Mexico. So again, this was based on the Kenner card backs, but if you look down here, you'll see where it says Made in Mexico right here in the corner. And then, as I've mentioned in a different video, the other distinguishing factor is that all of the ones that were produced on these card backs by the Lili Ledy factory, they do have a hole, an air hole that goes through the back of the card. So if it doesn't have that, it's probably it's probably a recard or a fake. So that's something to keep in mind. But why am I telling you all this? Well, the interesting thing is that, if you see a figure on eBay that's for sale and advertised as a Lili Ledy, yes, it is technically a Lili Ledy. But if it has the Made in Mexico label, like you saw in this Darth Vader, it's going to have Kenner accessories. So oftentimes those Kenner accessories are labeled, or they have numbers on the blasters, things like that lets them know which ones were made in Kenner U.S. factories versus the Lili Ledy factories. And so, for example, this is the Made in Mexico Darth Vader. So it has a Kenner, either a Kenner cape. I know it has a Kenner saber versus the Lili Ledy, and I can show you why in a second. One other distinguishing factor for the Lili Ledy is that you'll see that they do have a thick saber tip. So this saber tip is much thicker than, say, I did bring out a Hong Kong, the standard Hong Kong Darth Vader, and you can see that saber tip is quite a bit thinner. So let's do them right next to each other, see if it'll show up. But you can see how much thicker that saber tip is. And it's also much more translucent. So that's something to keep in mind, is that, some of these accessories are slightly different. The other distinguishing factor for the Lili Ledy Vader is that the neck. I mean, look how long that neck is versus the Vader. It's going to be hard to see because the Vader has his cape up. The Hong Kong Vader has his cape up. So this one on your left is the Hong Kong made Vader, and the one on your right is the one made in Lili Ledy's Mexican factories. But you can see the difference in the neck sculpt, or the neck length. So that's one thing to keep in mind. But the Made in Mexico figures will have either a Kenner cape or a Kenner saber. Or something on that will be U.S. made. It could be the figure itself is U.S. made. Oftentimes they shipped Hong Kong figures. And just now looking at it, I think I misspoke, because This made in Mexico Vader does also have the Lili Ledy saber tip. So it's the same Lili Ledy thick saber tip. So I was incorrect there. So what that means is that either the cape or the figure itself was made in Hong Kong. So keep that in mind. Now, what does that mean? Does that mean that every Lili Ledy figure comes from a Lili Ledy card back, those really expensive ones? Well, obviously not, because you can buy loose graded Lili Ledy figures for, still relatively inexpensively. So what that means is that in order to be a Lili Ledy figure, as denoted on the AFA label, they could come from these kind of card backs if all of the accessories and the figure were made in the Lili Ledy factory. And so for this one, for example, it's labeled as made in Mexico. This one has the thick saber tip. So the reason it's labeled made in Mexico versus Lili Ledy is, number one, the card back is the Kenner card back. But number two, if this figure was taken off of this card, let's say this card was heavily damaged and they wanted to grade it loose. Well, if all of this, if the figure and the cape and the saber were all made in the Lili Ledy factory, that is the same thing as this. That'll be exactly the same thing. So what happened with this one, for example, this is a U85, uncirculated 85. Come on, focus. There we go. So uncirculated 85, that means that someone took that off of a damaged card, a heavily damaged card, like this one, and because either the figure, which I assume it's the figure, or the cape, since the saber we know is a Lili Ledy, then it got the Made in Mexico label instead of the Lili Ledy label. So anyway, this is way more information and way more detail and diving into it than you probably want to know. But there's some people out there who are maybe considering Lili Ledys or have seen these AFA labels and are trying to understand what is the difference between Made in Mexico versus Lili Ledy, and that's your answer. And even if you go on eBay right now, I've seen a few items that are loose graded and they're labeled as Lili Ledy, but the AFA sticker is Made in Mexico. I don't know if there's any real difference in resale value or what they're really worth, but from my perspective, if I'm going to pay a lot of money for one of these things, the Lili Ledy label is what you want, because that means everything in there is Lili Ledy, versus Made in Mexico, where something in here, including possibly the figure, is Kenner made. So anyway, again, nerd alert, whoop whoop whoop, nerd alert. But I just wanted to show you some of that information. If I can find that link when I upload this video, then I will put that in the description, because it's a really cool information and gives you a little bit of the backstory. So anyway, thanks for watching, and I'll talk to you soon.